Thanks very much for your time. How does politics of fear work for populist parties? How do they instrumentalize the fear?
Well, this is, of course, always context dependent, but far-right populist parties thrive on crisis. So they either construct or exaggerate crisis, or they instrumentalize existing crisis and create a lot of scenarios of threat and danger. And then they construct themselves as the only party and the only people who can save us from this crisis and this danger. So they first construct fear and then they construct hope. So this is an interdependent pattern, which is of course not new, which has been around for many, many centuries, but they are very clever in using this pattern.
Mm-hmm. Your book, Politics of Fear, was published before Trump and Brexit, and even before the surge of populist leaders, and it's very to the point. How do you explain this?
Well, I published the first edition. In the meantime, there's a second edition. I don't know if you know that. It just came out 2021, and it's updated. I can show you what it looks like. Just a second.
Mm-hmm.
This is the second edition now, where I also write about Trump and Brexit and all the new developments. Yeah, but in the first edition, it was obvious, looking at the Austrian-Italian cases, Hungary, etc., that this politics of fear was very successful in the far right. And if you look at Europe and the European Union, the oldest far-right populist parties were the French one, at that time Front National, and the Austrian one, the Austrian Freedom Party. And especially after 1989 and the fall of the Iron Curtain, Haider's party, the Freedom Party, gained very much in the opinion polls and also lots of votes, because they instrumentalized a xenophobic rhetoric against the migrants from the former Eastern Bloc countries. And then 2015, after in the refugee movement, we experienced a very similar xenophobic pattern in the discourse. It was just now people coming from more far away, yeah, from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Africa, Somalia, Sudan, etc. But basically the exclusionary rhetoric is very similar.
Right. As you have stated in your lectures, Professor, almost all populist parties in Europe are successful. How do you explain this?
Well, this is an interesting question. I think it's very, well, again, context specific, because it's very different in the South, yeah, where there is a much bigger polarization, and also the left wing and center left parties have been quite successful in Spain and Portugal. In Italy, we now have a sort of technocratic government. But anyway, the Lega, which was first very successful, had to leave the government. And in Greece, we have a huge polarization. But it's different in the rich countries. And now, speaking of Austria, Denmark, um, Switzerland, Norway, yeah, probably the richest country in the countries in the European Union, the fear was created that the people would lose. So they hadn't lost yet, but they would lose. So sort of the fear of losing all the social welfare, the benefits, etc., because there were the refugees coming in or the migrants, that was mobilized and instrumentalized. So that is called welfare chauvinism. That was very strong in these basically rich countries. And then you have countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, um, Poland, Romania, etc., which are poor countries, but there the fear of losing their identity and their language and Christianity, the Occident, was mobilized. Basically because, for example, Hungary, so many Hungarians had emigrated. So the fear was mobilized, Hungarians would die out. Yeah, that is something Orban uses. So you have very different motives. Yeah, so what I basically say also in the second edition now is there is no one size fits all. Yeah, one has to really look at the context, at the history, at the socio-political, economic development to understand cultural development, to understand how these parties work.
All right. Uh, when and how the populist parties get unsuccessful, is there a way to defeat them at the ballot box?
Well, I think obviously there is a way. Yeah. In some countries that has already happened. Sometimes they shoot themselves in their own foot, uh, like in Austria. Yeah, that happened twice with big scandals, and the government failed, and they lost a lot of votes. Yeah, but they sort of come again. Yeah, if they find a new niche and a new way of mobilizing voters. Uh, in other cases, it really depends. For example, um, if there is a good opposition, yeah, if there's an alternative program. So if you have no alternative program, you will not defeat them. So you have to actually provide alternatives. You have to provide more participation, and so that people, uh, citizens, feel that they are acknowledged and that their worries are being taken seriously. And a third possibility is that the parties vanish, but that the conservative parties take on their agenda. Yeah, that's what I call now in my second edition normalization. So the far right agenda become normalized, and the mainstream conservatives um, uh, kind of implement the programs of the far right. So in that way, the parties might even vanish or get small, but the agenda survive.
Right, right. Uh, Professor, there's a term you use, which is post-shame. Can you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think that is important. There's a lot of talk about post-truth era. Now we have seen that there are many politicians who lie a lot, and of course the example of Donald Trump is obvious. But lying is not new in the far right. Yeah, and lying is not new in politics at all. Politicians have always lied. But as Hannah Arendt has shown and other theorists have shown, but they were sanctioned and they had to apologize or they lost or something. And now lying is possible, it just doesn't matter. Yeah, and that is what I call this post shame. You don't have to be ashamed, you don't have to apologize for lying, for offending people, for swearing, for being sexist or racist or whatever. uh, it it just doesn't matter. Yeah, and this, I think, is really a new stage in this development of the far right. That certain conventions and taboos have been violated, and that these new discourses have become acceptable. And this shamelessness, as I call it, also has a sort of mobilizing way, because many people, Trump voters, for example, were um, were very happy that uh, Trump finally said what everybody was thinking. Yeah. So the appeal to the people, to this alleged homogeneous people, is very important, and that these politicians construct themselves as those people who can um, not only save the people, but who dare say what everybody thinks. Yeah, and that in many ways has also been emancipatory, because then people say, well, we don't have to be ashamed that we have these thoughts. We don't have to be ashamed that we are sexist. We don't have to be ashamed that we're racist. We don't have to be ashamed that we're unemployed. Yeah, because that's because of the elites and the liberals and the intellectuals and etc. So this shamelessness speaks in many ways to the electorate.
Right, right. Well, actually, I would just ask you that you use shameless normalization. Uh, what is so shamelessly normalized in recent years?
Well, exactly what I've just mentioned, the shamelessness, making it acceptable um, to lie, uh, to violate conventions of dialogue and negotiation, uh, to denounce and defame your enemies in ways which violate everything which we were used to, politeness, truth, sincerity, all those values which are very important in interaction. Um, and this has become totally acceptable. So it seems to be the case that we live in parallel worlds, yeah, and then uh, parallel discourse worlds, and those worlds cannot interact anymore. So I think that is really something new, yeah, in this very um, sort of strong way in which it is enacted. Let's take an example of Orban. Yeah,
Mhm.
um, I think he is a prime example. I mean, uh, the Commission and many heads of state have said and declared, and also Article 7 has been invoked against Hungary, and it doesn't matter. And then Orban will say, okay, there's some little formal thing which we can change, yeah, to abide to the rules, but basically the content of the policies don't change. And the EU has been quite helpless and doesn't really have the resources to implement the sanctions. And in that way, Orban has implemented very authoritarian measures, for
Mhm.
example, against press freedom, against the freedom of universities, and so forth. Yeah.
Mhm. You argue that instrumentalizing the media, both traditional and new, is part and parcel of the immediate success of populist parties, populist movements. What should media do to escape the trap of mainstreaming the populist parties?
Well, that's also a good question. I think that if possible, the media should, on the one hand, also comment and explain what is happening, not just print what was said, but sort of frame it in a different way. They also don't always have to bring every provocation and scandal on page one. But that, on the other hand, is why they sell well. Yeah, so there is an economic side to it, which is, I think, very important to acknowledge. And right now in Austria, we are experiencing, for example, what is called message control. So media who are not basically printing what the government uh, hands out every week in press conferences get less money, they get less advertisements, so they're basically starved. Yeah. Um, and it's very difficult for them to survive as independent media. So the pressure is very big. It doesn't have to be as big as in Turkey, as we know, where journalists are being put into jail and so forth. But there are subtle ways, yeah, or more or less subtle ways of disciplining uh, the media and journalism. And on top of that, there is the possibility now that every politician basically uh, can be their own media. Yeah. So you don't need the traditional media. So Trump tweeted. He didn't need the media. Yeah.
Yes.
He he delegitimized the sort of good and really sophisticated media and said that was fake news. And he legitimized what he called the alternative fact. Yeah? And he could do that via his own propaganda tool, which was tweets. He didn't need the media. Yeah. And so every politician now can have their own whatever, yeah, Telegram, Instagram, uh, Facebook, you name it, yeah. And they have many, many friends and followers, and they're in their own bubbles. And that's what I meant with this parallel worlds. You don't even have to acknowledge and interact with the serious quality media anymore. So I think that is a very dangerous tendency. And we see the delegitimization of serious quality media in all the far right parties.
Mm. All right. Uh, US President Joe Biden defeated one of the strongest populist leader, namely Mr. Trump. Are there any lessons for Europe to take which deals with its own populist leaders?
Yes, I think absolutely. So I think that the victory of Joe Biden has many factors, of course. Yeah, but one really big factor was that Trump failed in the COVID crisis. I mean, he sort of spent a lot of money for to produce the vaccines, but he um, sort of euphemized and relativized the danger of the COVID crisis. And of course, the hundred thousands of dead Americans was one fact which nobody could dismiss. Yeah, more dead people than in both world wars. Yeah, I mean that was sort of one major factor which helped Biden. Um, Unfortunately for the dead, yeah, but that was, of course, the tipping point. I think without COVID, Trump would have won. Yeah, and so there are sort of tipping points when there is something which uh, sort of the drop which makes everything causes everything to flow over. And the second thing is we should be aware that Biden only won by very few votes. Yeah, I mean all in all he had a lot of win. Yeah, millions of votes. But if you look at the states, his victory was very small. Yeah. Um, so I think it was very important to have institutions which didn't fail, the justice which was kept. Uh, Also, some Republican senators who abided to justice and didn't abide to Trump's big lie. Yeah. Um, so there's this sort of civil courage, which was important, and then also a program, a very good, I mean, an important alternative program. So Biden had promised not only to fight the crisis and to provide vaccines, but he also promised uh, better health service, uh, to fight against poverty, tax the rich, a lot of alternative programs. So I think all this together, and the mobilization was very important. Yeah, sort of mobilizing voters who hadn't voted, to help voters get registered. I mean, the US is a very strange place, yeah, in comparison to some European countries. And there's an interesting example. We don't have to go to the US to see what can, how these shifts can happen. There was a very interesting study by Leonie de Jonge, or Jonge, I don't know how you pronounce her name in Flemish. She's Belgian, but she works in Groningen in the Netherlands. And she did a study on the far right parties in Belgium. Yeah, and there's one in the Flemish part and one in the French part. And there are two social democratic parties, one in the Flemish part and one in the French part. So in the Flemish part, the Social Democratic Party thought they would have to overtake the far right in strict anti-immigration measures, and sort of kind of had even more xenophobic rhetoric, and they lost heavily. And the far right won because that's their brand. Yeah, you shouldn't compete with their brand. Yeah. In the French part, uh, the Social Democrats won. Why? Because they allied with the media. They found a cordon sanitaire so that the media didn't publish everything, every provocation and scandal, and they went back to, or had an alternative, really left-wing program, yeah, against poverty, human rights, uh, gender equality, anti-discrimination, and so forth. The Social Democrats won, the far right lost. So I think this is even like an experiment where you can see um, what different programs and alternative strategies uh, might imply.
How do you spell the name of the researcher, Professor?
Uh, Jonge.
Okay.
I quote her in my book. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Uh, After the Cold War, it was believed by many academicians that the liberal democracy has won, and all the countries would reform themselves to attain the standards of liberal democracy. Right now, we witness just the opposite. What went wrong?
Again, this is a question where we could write many books. Yeah. And of course, I can't answer in any differentiated way. But I think that there are, again, many factors. One factor is, of course, neoliberal economic policies, which cut through the social welfare, yeah, and basically inequality, the rise of inequality, yeah, is obvious. Um, uh, Look at the United Kingdom, for example, yeah, but also what happened in the European South. The second, I think, important factor is that uh, this fear of losing out, yeah, which I already mentioned. So in the financial crisis, basically one could say simplistically, the banks were saved but not the people. So the fear of losing out, that uh, our generation could not provide a better life for the next generation, became obvious. Yeah. Um, a third, I think, factor is certainly uh, the inequality, the global inequality. Yeah, I mean, we all live on one planet. We have climate crisis, we have migration, and certainly the EU or countries in the EU had no clue how to deal with migration. Yeah, they thought we could invite guest workers, they would leave again. Yeah, so um, they would go back and they would just work and then go back. Yeah, and obviously countries have changed. They became much more diverse, which triggered all these fears, identity issues, yeah, which we already talked about. And I think that these crises have become more and more. Then we had, of course, global civil wars, other wars, um, and 9/11, yeah, which was another tipping point. So there are many huge problems which are unsolved, but I really believe that the rising inequality and the incompetence to acknowledge socioeconomic change and the changes uh, in the global north and global south to accommodate have been crucial for the development as we see it.
And the last question, Professor, uh, if this trend continues, I mean, the success of populist parties in Europe, what sort of a Europe shall we have in 20, 30 years? Uh, what is your expectation?
Well, I'm not a prophet, yeah, and I'm also not a political scientist, so those would have probably better predictions. But I think that the EU is uh, endangered as a transnational entity, because if the EU cannot guarantee the human rights anymore, which are part and parcel of the treaties, yeah, uh, and cannot guarantee uh, the Children Convention, all these many treaties, yeah, which have been signed, it will sort of fall apart into countries which abide to these conventions and countries which go a very different way, like Hungary, Poland, and other countries. And it might then go back or continue into a more economic enterprise again. Um, but that would not guarantee peace, and it would not guarantee what the EU actually stands for. I personally am very worried, yeah, about this, because we see these developments. We see that the EU, the heads of states cannot find a compromise to how to save hundreds of children. I mean, this rich continent cannot save hundreds of children from Greek islands. I mean, this is really like as if nothing from history has been learned. Um, and religion, again, is providing such a dangerous element and such a dangerous factor. Yeah, the culturalism which is taking over. So I'm very worried. Yeah, I think that there are reforms which are necessary, strong reforms, and the nations, the EU Commission will they will have to think about, and hopefully the citizens can participate in which direction one will go. I mean, there's an inherent contradiction in the EU and the structure of the EU, that on the one hand, we have the European Parliament, we all vote for the MEPs, etc. On the other hand, the heads of states are the most powerful. Yeah? So um, the nation state still is more powerful than the transnational entity. And I think this contradiction has to be solved in some way. Otherwise, I don't see how this can continue in a, what I would think, a positive, peaceful way.
Mhm. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you.